Let's go a little deeper into our lead story. The Prime Minister defending publicly, under oath, his decision to invoke the Emergencies Act during the convoy protest last winter.
I am absolutely serene and confident that I made the right choice.
He argued that before that moment, police didn't have a real plan to deal with the occupation of downtown Ottawa. Justin Trudeau was the final witness to testify before the inquiry moves on to a new phase. Let's bring in two journalists who've been following this very closely. CBC parliamentary reporter David Cochrane and Ottawa reporter for the Globe and Mail, Shannon Proudfoot. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hi there.
We asked each of you to pick a key moment from today. And David, let's start with yours. It's when the Prime Minister was asked why he didn't meet with protesters. Let's listen.
It was clear that it wasn't that they just wanted to be heard. They wanted to be obeyed. They wanted us to change public policy, public health policy designed to help Canadians, and we're going to occupy locations across this country and interfere with the lives of Canadians until such a decision was taken.
And David, what's notable about that?
I think that really shows the situation the country was in, at least in the relationship of the government and police on one side and the protesters on the other side, that it was completely dug in. Negotiations were never going to resolve this, and it was either going to end in capitulation or enforcement. And when you look at how it played out, Ian, whether it was Coots or whether it was the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor or the occupation of the downtown here in Ottawa, it was ultimately police action of one form or another that made this happen. And it became very clear throughout this inquiry that talks were not going to work. The convoy had no coherent and clear leadership that could get everybody to move as a monolith. They did a great job in getting a lot of people to come to these places. There was no reciprocal capacity to get them to leave, even if the government capitulated. So that kind of showed the hardened dynamic on both sides and helps explain why we've ended up exactly where we've ended up.
And Shannon, the Prime Minister spoke about what was on his mind as he chose to invoke the act. Let's listen to that excerpt.
But I also reflected on, okay, what if I don't sign it? What if the worst had happened in those following days? What if someone had gotten hurt? What if a police officer had been put in a hospital? What if when I had an opportunity to do something, I had waited and we had the unthinkable happen over the coming days?
And so, Shannon, as you heard that testimony, what was notable about it for you?
I think there are sort of two things going on there. He was at pains to argue that he hadn't made up his mind because there were some questions about the timelines of the meetings the day before and whether it was sort of a foregone conclusion. So he was really trying to walk out the idea that he was still truly contemplating whether he should do this, that he got advice from the clerk and it was still possible for him to say no. But then I think there's a much more sort of political and emotional thing going on here, which is that he's kind of taking us along on this alternate reality, this what-if scenario, if he had not done it. And this is obviously a very kind of emotional argument for doing it because you can't prove a negative. But he was kind of contemplating what could have been the damage and what could have been sort of the unknowns, which is pretty powerful and also a very convenient political argument because, of course, we don't know how this would have played out on another timeline.
Yeah, and so let me ask both of you, maybe David, I'll start with you on this. You're political reporters, you have a sense of how things do play out, and we've had testimony from cabinet ministers as well. So David, do you think much will change given what the Prime Minister said today and how he said it?
I think politically, Ian, opinions are pretty set on this. I don't think there's a lot of undecided Canadians on the convoy, and I don't think a lot of normal Canadians do plain literal readings of the CSIS Act and how it applies to the Emergency Act. And I also think the Prime Minister had a pretty good day. Like, he showed good command of the subject, good understanding of why he did what he did, and kind of widened the goalposts in the argument as to why the government felt it needed to invoke the Emergencies Act through his explanation of the factors that went into the decision-making process. And when you stack that on to the police narrative of this cocktail of incompetence and infighting and inaction that really made the Emergency Act inevitable, it bolsters his case. It's just up to Judge Rouleau now to decide whether or not it was appropriate.
And Shannon, I don't want to ask you to predict this, but again, the same thing that I asked David, like in terms of what you know about the politics of this country and what you saw today, what kind of impact do you think it might have?
Yeah, I agree with David. I don't think there's going to be a lot of minds changed, mostly because probably normal people who don't spend their time the way we do weren't watching this day to day. But I do think there could be some interesting political wrinkles sort of within the Liberal Party. I think there's been a lot of speculation about how much longer Trudeau will stick around as leader. He's been very unequivocal in saying he's not going anywhere. But of course, there's a lot of sort of chatter. He's facing a new Conservative leader in Pierre Poilievre, who's very energized and has a lot of excitement behind him. And I think maybe if you were a Liberal who was kind of starting to think maybe Justin Trudeau should be showing himself the door, he did put in a good showing here. We sort of saw kind of vintage Trudeau. Well, maybe not vintage Trudeau, actually, a different face. He's not someone who typically explains his decisions, who walks things out, who really answers things in anything other than sort of talking points or value statements. And today we saw for 5 hours, he was really walking through decisions. He had been well briefed. He looked like he was really in good command of it. So I think he might have put in sort of a good word for himself, if you will, here, even just with his own partisans or with people within his caucus.
Yeah, and let's not lose sight, and this is not a partisan comment, but here we had a day where I could be sitting on my couch at home and watching live the Prime Minister of Canada under oath being cross-examined, right? It was a remarkable display of transparency, which is built right into the Emergencies Act. Shannon, I'm envious. You were in the room, and you saw a lot of things, including, I guess, the interaction, was it, between protesters and the Prime Minister? Tell us about that.
Yeah, the room was much, much more packed than it's been for any other witness. So you could see that there was great interest, and you could just sort of tell both by the shirts people were wearing, people had branded shirts, and also just the way they were responding emotionally, that the vast majority of them were convoy supporters. And there was a real sort of, I don't know if buzz is the right word, because to me that sort of indicates positive. There was a real energy in the room. And then as time went on in his testimony, at first people were quite quiet. It was sort of surprising given some of the energy we've seen in people responding to other witnesses. But there were a few points where he said things, including that clip that we teed up before David, where he was talking about the possible damage done, where the room sort of razzed him and responded really strongly to his strongest statements about sort of their intentions or the worst possible outcomes here. So there was really this back and forth, and then we saw Justice Rouleau kind of warning people, settle down or I'm going to boot you out.
David, a minute left for that classic panel ending question. What's next? What are you looking for?
Well, obviously, I want to see where Judge Rouleau lands. We need the verdict, right? This was kind of a trial on the government's action, one they set in motion the day they invoked the Emergencies Act. Does he find whether it was appropriate or not? But also, what recommendations do they need to update the Emergency Act and some of our laws? I mean, this is a law written in 1988, right, when the fax machine was the dominant technology. And it became pretty clear throughout this, Ian, that legislation drafted the year Police Academy 5 was a top movie in theaters is not appropriate to deal with security and policing challenges and economic challenges of 2022. So how do we fix this going forward? We're always advised to have an emergency kit in our home for disasters. Most people don't do it. The government has an emergency act for disasters that it needs to keep up to date. It hasn't done it, and we've seen that on manifest display over the past 10 months.
Look, this is a serious topic and serious issues, but to manage to squeeze in a reference to Police Academy 5, David, very artful. And thanks to both of you. Really appreciated your insights.
Thank you.